In my last video, I talked about the 5th generation format war of discs and cartridges. Today, I'd like to focus on the impact it had specifically on the libraries of the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, as those were the two main consoles in the West. Of course, the PS1's library is over 10 times the size of the N64's, that much is obvious, but what effects did this actually have? I want to go not through only the starting factors and the effects they cause, but also the other effects that those effects caused. The first thing we need to cover are the prices of the consoles and games. Now, the PS1 and N64 were price matched for most of their lives. The PS1 came out for $300, then the N64 released for $200, and then the PS1 quickly dropped to $200 to match it, then when one dropped to $150, the other went down to $150. At the end of the generation, you could get both of them for around $100, and the PlayStation 1's PS1 revision also dropped below that number after the PS2 was already out, but that's besides the scope. The games themselves, though, were a very different story. You see, the PS1 used CDs, as you know from earlier. They could store 650 megs of data, they were cheap enough to where multiple discs could be packaged with the game and not raise the price, and they were fast enough for the time, though they were sort of flimsy when you give them to a child who might break them. The N64 used cartridges. They were way more expensive, way more robust, and stored way less data. 8 to 12 megs until late 97, 16 megs until late 98, 32 megs until late 99, and from that point onwards 64 megs. What difference did that make? Well, what differences is the better question. The first difference is the developer one. I want to cover it first because basically all the other issues are downstream from it, of course. We're talking about games, we need to know about how they were made. You see, on the PlayStation 1 front, while some games were $60, many of them were 50, 40, 30, or even 20. Many new N64 games were 80, though they would sometimes drop to 60 or 50 if they had lower storage sizes. We know that from earlier. But what profits could developers actually see from these cartridges? Well, like up to $30 per game on PlayStation and not that much money on the N64. Generally speaking, from the information I've managed to find, just to manufacture an N64 cartridge, Nintendo 64 developers paid around $30 per cartridge. On the PS1 front, it was only $1 to $2. Royalties were also higher on Nintendo's front, about $20 per cartridge, while Sony only really charged $9 to $10 per disc, though take either of these two last figures of royalties with a mountain, planet of salt maybe, because getting info on this kind of stuff is really hard, because all we have are estimates due to these being private dealings and private contracts. So, at the end, what do we get? Well, more expensive N64 games if they want to recoup the license costs. If we'd imagine two games had the exact same budget on both consoles, and only bought one batch of discs and cartridges so they can't reinvest the money they made from the sales into more sales, the PS1 game would either have more discs to sell or a higher budget. This would be because less money went towards printing discs compared to cartridges, but also developers would need to sell more N64 games to even break even, which meant that games had to be less experimental. There's a reason why so many insanely unique and strange games came from no-name third parties on the PS1, while most of the unique N64 games came from the more well-known companies, and there were also far less of them. And that's basically why there were 10 times the games in the PS1. Of course, this had some pretty notable effects for consumers. For instance, as I mentioned before, if you want to buy a game console in early 97, both the PS1 and N64 were the same price. But if you want to buy some action stuff and you didn't own a PC previously, like on the N64 you can buy Turok for $80. On the PlayStation, you get Doom 1 and Doom 2 and Final Doom. Two games, $40 each. And if you didn't want Final Doom, you can maybe get Resident Evil? For $10 more, you could get Doom 1 and 2 and Final Fantasy? See what I mean here? Well, if you don't, PS1 owners generally owned more PS1 games because they were just cheaper. The fact so many more PS1 games sold compared to how many consoles sold proves this, though this has an interesting opposite effect. You see, when you entered a 90s game store, the PS1 shelf space was often so much larger than the N64 one. While PS1 owners could find all kinds of games there, the N64 owners generally just had the new releases and whatever somebody traded in. So, a PS1 owner could have a higher chance of finding a game they liked in a genre they liked. If you really enjoyed Final Fantasy VII that you bought earlier, maybe Ark the Lad could be a fun time. Breath of Fire 3, Wild Arms? But on the N64, it just wasn't so easy. Sure, half the library was racing and sports games, but let's be real here, half the library was also complete garbage, and a lot of that garbage was in that racing and sports games half. So if you liked, I don't know, Mario 64, because it was really fun, you had to wait for quite a lot longer to find another quality 3D platformer on the console. If you bought an N64 at release, you'd have to wait for almost a year to get a second 3D platformer, and the one you got was Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. Not a bad game for sure, but not really similar to Mario 64. Actually decent platformers like Gex, or good ones like Banjo, would take until 98 to come out. So what do you play until that point? Well, I'm sure you don't want to spend $80 on fucking Glover, War Gods, or Clay Fighter 63 1/3. So what do you buy? Well, Nintendo and Rare are like close partners, right? And Rare recently released Diddy Kong Racing, and you know what, I could do with a racing game. And then you bought the racing game, and because it was a game that was made by a competent studio, it was fun. And that's kind of what a lot of N64 owners did. They would buy a few games from Nintendo and Rare because, well, the games were expensive and they had a guarantee of at least being enjoyable. This is also why I also don't buy the whole, but the best-selling N64 game outsold the best-selling PS1 game. Gran Turismo sold 10.9 million units, while Mario 64 sold 11.9 million. However, Mario 64 was one game, and Gran Turismo got a sequel 2 years later, meaning most consumers would have bought GT2 and GT1 if they went to a store in 1999 and saw both of them on the shelves at the same time. That's also why, in my opinion, comparing the best-selling franchises, or just games of their individual releases, is, in my opinion, a far better strategy. On the N64, if you look at the most best-selling franchises, Pokemon is first with 14.55 million, Mario 64 is then at 11.91 million, Zelda is there at 10.96, Donkey Kong sold 10.15, Mario Kart 64 9.87, you know, it's there. Meanwhile, on the PS1, Final Fantasy sold 26.39 million, Tomb Raider sold 25.9, Crash Bandicoot sold 25.53, Gran Turismo sold 20.22 million, and finally Tekken sold 16.62 million. Interestingly enough, the fifth best-selling PS1 franchise outsold the best-selling N64 franchise. Adding those numbers up, interestingly enough, it's 57 million units on the N64 front and 114 million units on the PS1 front. Keep in mind that the N64 only sold 225 million games, so the top 5 best-selling PS1 franchises actually sold about half as much as the entirety of the N64 library. We'll get to something regarding this a little bit later. But what about the other games, you may ask? Well, this is where this video transitions into the rental section. You see, in many reviews of N64 games, I've seen that they said, oh, well, this game could be a fun rental, but please don't buy this thing. So, for the people who've never rented anything in their lives, I did a few times when I was little, but that quickly faded away by the time I got old enough to actually be able to rent stuff. So most of the time, you'd like rent a game for a few days for like $5. Maybe you'd pay $10 for a full week. considering how short some of these games were, that's actually not a bad deal. Also, considering that sometimes you had good deals, browsing Reddit, one person said that a local shop had 6 rentals for 7 days for $10 as long as you didn't want any of the new releases, and honestly that would have been a really good system for testing out games that you'll then see if you want to properly buy or take back. It's really interesting. There's just one little caveat. So you know how I mentioned that the PS1 games had discs and RPGs and stuff? Yeah, so that was basically like an anti-rental block. Renting an RPG to beat it in an entire week is pretty challenging if you have actual life things to do, though you could always save your progress to the memory card and re-rent the game multiple times, though for some reason, when some PS1 games that were ported to the West, they still got fucked. The original release of Resident Evil is made way too difficult on the original PS1 release, 1.0 version. I don't know why they made it so hard in North America, fuck you I guess. Same goes with some games that were localized like Luna. It's really stupid, I don't understand why they did it, but it is what it is. If I don't complain about it here, I never will. Anyways, couple that rental difference with how cartridges are just better for rentals because chances are an idiot child can't damage the cartridge as easily as they can damage a CD, and there's a reason why, while some N64 owners rented a lot of games, a lot of PS1 owners just modded the console. But because of this system, many kids had their fond memories of the few games they would actually properly own. You know, not rent to play and then return, but actually own. It was their library of a few games, versus a PS1 owner's, who's most often a little bit older, library of 20-something games. Yeah, so is it just nostalgia? Well, sort of. And because of this nostalgia pooling around smaller amounts of first-party games, it was easier to promote the few games that you really loved as good, versus somebody who had a PS1 claiming all 50 of the games they had were good. Even if both sides were correct, because it's far easier to just continuously repeat how Zelda Ocarina of Time was better than Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, and Tactics, if you get what I mean. But instead of dwelling on that little nostalgia thing, let's look at some reviews, shall we? Because there's another interesting thing I need to show you. For this segment, we'll be using Moby Games and its Moby Score, as it does a really good job aggregating these old, often magazine reviews. So, let's check out some of the most abysmal games on the N64. There are 6 that are utterly abysmal, so below a 5 Moby score. Superman 64, Batman Beyond, Carmageddon 2, Power Rangers, Dual Heroes, and Jeopardy! Superman 64 and Carmageddon 2 were made by Titus, which is really funny. All of them deserve to be here. There are actually 23 utterly abysmal games on the PS1, such as The Mission, Batman Beyond, I heard about this one somewhere else, Gotham City Racer, Dreams, Hugo 2, Spawn, Kiss Pinball, and I'm gonna stop reading these because there's one specific one which is really interesting. Marines Project Swarm, a legendarily shitty game. But what is this? A 6.4 when we click? But it was 4.9 just a moment ago. Ah yes, it's a 6.7 on the N64. Now I tried out both of these games and they're basically exactly the fucking same. Even if there are minor differences between these two, it's not a difference between a 6.7 and a 4.9. So, let's look at some of the example reviews that I found. So, the best Nintendo 64 version review is a glowing 10 out of 10 from Funvision. Google translated, it says, I've actually Google translated quite a few of them. Marines is a gripping first-person shooter that really gets going in 2-player co-op. The atmosphere is at times terrifying and the difficulty level is bearable. The Turok engine was used for the graphics, and they are accordingly well done. This game is a must-have for all science fiction fans. Get it now, it's hot. There's a single solid 7.8 out of 10 PS1 review from Consoles Plus as well. It says, despite acclaim's obvious good attentions, Armorines remains a classic Doom-like, but without any real major surprises. How's that a 7.8? I don't know. However, there's an interesting difference, right? The second highest review of the PS1 version is 43% by GameZilla, where the reviewer just says it has no good points and wants to give the game away so they don't own it anymore. There are two N64 reviews lower than this by Gaming Age and Imperium, but the rest just aren't. IGN gave the N64 version a 5.8, and Nintendo Power gave this hunk of shit a 7.7, so I just started digging a little bit more. And this continues. Another utterly abysmal game is WCW Backstage Assault. A 4.9 on PlayStation, but a 6 on the Nintendo 64. And you know what the best part is? IGN reviewed this game on both platforms. They gave the N64 version a 4, and the PlayStation version a 2, and the contents of the review are mostly the same, telling you to avoid this game like the plague, though the PlayStation one recommends other wrestling games, while the N64 one just explains why the games are shit. And this is actually very important for later, this specific IGN thing, you'll see why. Other examples aren't so offensively one-sided and some have actual thought behind them, like the San Francisco Rush Extreme Racing port to the PS1 was awful. However, those are just some multi-platform examples. Generally speaking, a lot of older games have their review scores inflated for a few reasons. It was just harder to fact-check if some magazine was bullshitting or not. Sometimes, some reviewers from some companies didn't even play the games. A good sign of this is to have a very, very large variance of reviews. Let's take a horribly, heavily overlooked title on the PS1, Terracon. It has a 7.3 on Mobi, and most of its reviews are pretty damn high, 80s and a few 70s and like 150. Overall, the main points brought up is that the game is very ambitious, very cool, but it can be repetitive and the frame rate can get really bad during the intense combat. This is all true. The game itself is fun though. Now here's Buck Bumble on the N64, also a 7.3 out of Mobi, and the review scores are a lot more varied, and it's not only that, it's also well, I played this game, and it's complete garbage. And guess what? GameSpot has the only actual, real, proper review on it that is actually accurate to the game. Maybe there was another one in a foreign language I didn't click on, I don't know. It says that while the game isn't completely terrible, the fog is horrible, you turn really slowly, the game sucks, and generally to avoid it, and Nintendo Power said something else, which was, Ubisoft and Argonaut are to be congratulated on an excellent action game with a fresh theme, look, and sound, as well as fun gameplay. Play control is tight, and the weaponry is expressive. The buck stops here, I couldn't get enough of it. And it's not just okay, oh well that's his opinion, that's the point of a review, yes I agree, but he's wrong. It's not tight, it's extremely loose. What fresh look, yeah, it's fucking Silent Hill before Silent Hill, sure, you know what I mean, like, but that's just one example. An example of how absolutely inflated a lot of the N64 games were. But why? Why did Automobili Lamborghini, a pretty bland and shite game also made by the guys behind Superman 64, Carmageddon 2, Blues Brothers 2000s, and other games, get the same review score as Test Drive 6, an imperfect but still fun racing game? Now this is where context becomes important. Yes, review scores are inflated, but that's true on both systems. The real cause, and the cause for why that wrestling game was rated higher in the N64, was because often so few N64 games existed in a specific genre that it was hard to find comparison points. And at that point, how do you even rate a game if there's nothing to rate it to? Take Turok for instance. It had a higher review score than Doom 64. Why was that? Well, because Turok was the first FPS game on the system. By the time it released, nothing else really like it came out on the system, and it cemented itself as a quote-unquote good game. Then when subsequent Turoks came out, they were all compared to the older first one. Buck Bumble was basically the only game like it on the N64, excluding some other awful flight game. So it basically got a free pass, even if it was garbage. Meanwhile, on PlayStation, so many games came out in so many genres that there were a lot of comparison points. A 7 out of 10 on PlayStation was just worth more than a 7 out of 10 on the N64. That's why that wrestling game was a 2 on PlayStation but a 4 on the N64. Compared to all of the other wrestling games on the PS1, it deserves a 2. But compared to the N64 wrestling games, you know, it is a 4. Let's take another example, Wild Arms 2. A solid 7 out of 10. Also Tiger's Honey Hunt. 7 out of 10. It's some kind of Crash clone garbage if you're not aware. I want to transition into my final point now through these following reviews. Here are the 2 top scores of both games. For Wild Arms, RPG fan writes, overall, with great gameplay, an unforgettable final battle and great music, Wild Arms Second Ignition is one of the best RPGs that was released in the later half of 1999 so far. Now all I have to do is figure out why I only have 58% in my monster library. For Tiger's Honey Hunt, Retro Age writes, this game provides a lot of fun for the youngest. Fabulously beautiful and colorful graphics will attract every child in front of the TV. Tested on several pieces of 5 to 8-year-olds, it's hellishly addictive. If you serve this game to the youngest, forget about your N64 because it just changed owners. And yes, the final point is about the N64 being a kiddie system, but only for a bit. Because you know those cartridges I mentioned and how it's harder for an idiot child to break it? You know how Nintendo made at least decent quality family-friendly games and how Nintendo was a fairly well-known brand to parents at this point? And you get the picture. Well, both games had all-ages games like Mario and Spyro, and both games had a large amount of kiddie garbage, though the N64 was a smaller overall library, which meant that the aforementioned kiddie garbage seemed more prevalent than on PlayStation. Elmo's edutainment software, I'm not calling them games, made up like 0.5% of the N64's library, while only making 0.05% of the PS1's library. The N64 of course did have more serious games like GoldenEye Perfect Dark, but nothing compared to what PlayStation had. Horror games, sure, the N64 has a horror game, a worse version of RE2, and the PlayStation had 3 Resident Evils, also Silent Hill, also Dino Crisis, and more. It was clear which console was mostly played by kids and which one was also played on by kids, but also had a significantly older audience. One last bit to note is that there are a few types of gamers back in the 90s, and this extends to how it is today. First of all, you have PC gamers, those with multiple systems, and then those with just one system. The latter one were often kids or people who are less into gaming, the former was a lot of Europe up until the PlayStation, and the middle was a lot of people who either had a PC and a console or multiple consoles. And I would specifically like to focus on the people who owned both a PS1 and N64, because this was relatively common, and the way that these people bought games was pretty simple. You would buy the key Nintendo releases on the N64, and everything else on PlayStation. This is also how a lot of them handled the 6th generation, though there's a similar thing today with how many people buy Switch games on Switch and anything that's multi-platform on PC. And this made sense. Why buy a worse looking and sounding version of RE2 a year after it came out and pay more for it? generally speaking, even if the PS1 version of the game looked a tiny bit worse than the N64 one, it often not only cost less, but had a bit more content. And that cost is the important bit. It's cheaper, and for most people nowadays who experience retro games through PS Plus, NSO, or other means, pricing just isn't something they really consider. The used retro market is also fucked, inflated, bloated. It's just really hard to get a good perspective of how it actually was. At this point today, you're googling the minute differences between the PS1 and N64 version of Gex 2, as you can find them for a similar-ish inflated price online. But back in the day, you wouldn't do that. You would get the cheaper PS1 version, and choose correctly because that version happened to be better. I feel really sorry for the kids who got Mega Man Legends 64 instead of the PS1 version. But yeah, that's about it for the library differences. I know it seems like there was a bit of a PS1 bias going on throughout the video, but that's because the developers back then were very PS1 biased. It's just because it was a simpler console with cheaper games. Of course, I could still make like another video, or several videos actually, about going through the sort of mathematical differences between the libraries, which one had more of this, which one had more of that, but I feel like it would mostly just be beating a dead horse. I mean, basically in every genre, the PS1 wins in terms of game output because it just had such a larger library. But yeah, that's gonna be about it. See you next time.